Hi and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. I'm Stephanie and once again I'm here with my lovely co-host Michelle. Hi Michelle.
Hi Stephanie.
And we have our lighthouse keeper, our producer Jimmy Van, sitting in for this podcast as well. Hi Jimmy.
Hi Steph.
And this is going to be a bit of a fun one. We decided today that we're going to talk about some literary confessions. We're feeling confessional. We're feeling like we want to fess up to our darkest secrets. And share them with a worldwide audience, and also possibly damage our careers. So here goes. So today we're going to talk about some unpopular literary opinions and fess up to not having read books that we perhaps should have read. So I thought I'd start with asking the two of you, what's a book you're supposed to love, but that you really, really hate?
Jimmy and I are sharing a gaze at this point. I'm going to go for it.
You go for
Robinson Crusoe. It is just one of those books that I love in the sense that it's I understand that it's satirical. I understand that, there's a lot of ingenuity involved in creating sort of cheeses alone on an island with only a few goats and very little utensils. But, my God, Father, how many years, I actually remember my stomach just hitting the floor when I read that, sort of the 14 or so years had passed. And that for me was just the point at which I really gave up on the whole endeavour, and I couldn't for the life of me.
And it felt like 14 years too, reading it.
It's just about growing corn.
It is about growing corn. It is about a man who is so resourceful that I could beat him over the head with some of those fence posts that he erects. And I think also the bit that if you get to that very end, when you think that in all sort of in all reasonableness we should be drawing a line under that book and finishing it, and instead of that we end up with this wild wolf escapade that as far as I can tell feels like it's descended from another planet and leaves me in fact, if I had read the wolf incident first, I may well have had a different response to Robinson Crusoe.
And I think the bad thing is that, because we both taught 108 when Robinson Crusoe was on, and that's why we were forced to read 108. And I remember one year, Erin came to me afterwards and she said, Robinson Crusoe is a horrible, horrible man. She says, he enslaves people, he does terrible things. Why are we reading this book?
So this is one of the tutors.
This is one of the other tutors. And I just go, I don't know.
I can understand that it's very important in the history of the novel, and yes. I understand what it's doing politically. I understand how it's engaged in all of these debates around the 18th century, but it is so dull. Stop growing your corn, Robinson, and move on.
Look, I actually have a theory, because I have some very good friends who love Robinson Crusoe, and I am devoted to them, and in no way do I think that I wouldn't be friends with them based on their love of Robinson Crusoe.
Oh, I don't know, I'm maybe a bit harsher than you.
but I still have a sense that you can almost divide people along the lines of personalities and who love Robinson Crusoe for that perseverance, that sort of rolling up your sleeves and just getting on with things, and his own sort of sense of achievement, because let's not forget just how pleased with himself he is over all of these.
He likes his corn, what can I say? Sorry, the whole book is just corn for me. I don't really remember much of it besides corn.
Goats, don't forget the goats.
Goats and corn, yeah.
And the wolves.
Goats and corn. And then the country house.
Oh, yes.
Don't forget the country house, because if you're going to live by yourself on an island, you do want to have a country house.
And a slave.
And a slave, yeah. Let's not forget that it's horrendously racist.
Yes.
Another really good reason to dislike it.
It absolutely is. It is a racist sort of book, and the fact that there is absolutely no self-awareness on the part of Robinson Crusoe that perhaps it is a little bit problematic, selling people off at whim, is not good.
No,
it's not good. And as I say, I keep finding myself fascinated by the type of person who loves Robinson Crusoe, and then let's not forget that includes Virginia Woolf. And I adore Virginia Woolf. I adore her, and I've read her essay on Robinson Crusoe many times, and it's the way I prepare for class, because I think
it's more palatable than rereading Robinson Crusoe.
Because I keep thinking, if Virginia likes it,
there must be something there.
Well, I always think of a different book when you're talking about people who like Robinson Crusoe, and that's The Moonstone, because there's a character in The Moonstone, the butler, Betteridge, I think his name is, and he had this quirk. He said, whatever questions you have in your day, the answer can always be found in Robinson Crusoe. And he would give him a demonstration. He says, for example, you asked a question, so let me just randomly flick through a page, and he does, and he reads out the first passage he comes across and goes, there it is, the answer right there.
Does the answer have to do with corn?
Probably does. Eat corn. It solves
Eat corn.
Yes. And that's what I always think about. People who love Robinson Crusoe are like Betteridge. Yeah. The answers is found there. You just have to randomly flick through a page.
I would much rather find all my answers to life in The Moonstone than in Robinson Crusoe. The Moonstone is a great book.
I love The Moonstone.
Although once again, I am finding myself drawn to Robinson Crusoe through Wilkie Collins and Virginia Woolf. So this is my way into Robinson Crusoe. And any time that I meet resistance in a student, this is the way that I respond. Is through, I actually try and channel Virginia, or in this instance I'm going to add Wilkie Collins.
Well, I think he was satirising people who like Robinson Crusoe, but yes, you can draw in Wilkie Collins if necessary. But I'm not as generous as you, I have to say.
No, because I'm intrigued by how very differently people come to respond to Robinson Crusoe. I mean, I will be honest that the people that I know who love Robinson Crusoe, I'm not surprised that they love Robinson Crusoe.
There's so much judgment in this podcast already.
I know. I was just about to mention the name of another tutor who does love Robinson Crusoe, but I think
let's not slander the innocent.
And I actually don't think the world can cope. And I don't think the world can move forward without people who love Robinson Crusoe. I really believe that the world needs people who love Robinson Crusoe.
And it's just not us.
It takes all time.
It equally needs those who can't bear it. But I do think that it rather than sort of think about sort of culling people who fall on one side or the other fence, it's much more productive to think about the way we work together to create, sort of a much more livable
world.
That's an interesting choice of words.
Because let's face it, Robinson Crusoe left to himself, my godfather, I am never going to share an island with him.
There are very few people that I would want to share an island with, let's be honest here. Well, my book, I was going to mention a book that you're supposed to love but you hate, Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad.
Oh, there's a little bit of an intake of air there.
I know.
Ooh.
I just find it so... First of all, I find it really dull. I don't care about any character in the book. And usually I can cope with not liking characters, but I just don't care. And also I find it horrendously racist that all of these African people are used as the backdrop for this white man's journey to find himself. Like, there's been that critique has been made, obviously, by a lot of people, and I completely concur that it is racist. It's the kind of book that I know is supposed to be, it's a classic, it's supposed to be very good for you, everyone's supposed to have read it. It's just, I hate it. I never want to read it again. It's just the kind of book that rubbed up against me so...
But it is very short.
It is very short, and that is the
Which you
one...
can't say about Robinson Crusoe.
That is the one thing I will say about Heart of Darkness. It is blessedly short, mercifully short, but I will never read it again.
I'm still reeling.
I've stunned you. I've stunned you.
No, and I think the reason is because I completely agree that there is that really problematic element of the fact that there's not a single African character.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's no effort to sort of represent a sort of the psyche of an African character on a par with you know, sort of Conrad or with Marlowe or with Kurtz. There's sort of an instrumentalization, I guess, of that, of those. I'm thinking about the character who shovels keeps the furnace burning, and you know, sort of that hellish, and I think even reference to dogs. I think falls into that description of that African character there, and yet I guess that I'm always, there's so much ambivalence in that novel that I think that even with acknowledging the fact that there are no dimensional African characters, or you know, sort of dimensional women characters for that matter, I always feel as though there's a sort of an underlying thread that is asking us to, or that allows us to see that in it. And I guess also because I think some of the language for me is so beautiful, you know, that opening description of the Thames, and I think because I have a love of image, of writers who can produce images, and in some sense I guess Heart of Darkness is imagistic, so you know, it works almost through a sort of series of images, and I guess that sort of means that although I can completely concur with the sort of the problematics of it, I can still sort of love it and have moments where, even though we've, you know, years of teaching it, I can still sort of discover passages that will sort of cast me into a sort of one of those sort of moments where you're in the thrall of a text.
That was a very able defence of Heart of Darkness, and you tried very hard.
You failed.
But I still hate it. I'm sorry, Michelle. This is the one difference of opinion that we've had in all of our years of knowing each other.
Look, all of the books
what
that
about
we've
the film,
loved.
Apocalypse Now?
I love the film Apocalypse Now.
Does not redeem?
Yeah, but that's because it's a really good film. Book is still boring. I'm sorry, Jimmy. Are you going to defend the book too?
I'm not going to defend
Am I the
book.
fish that swims alone?
No. Look, I mean, I'm ambivalent about the book because on the one hand, I really appreciate it, and I think it's a really well-written book. But on the other hand, the ideas behind it are so bleak. It doesn't really correspond with my own worldviews. And when I read books like that, it takes me a while to recover. I mean, I just had a class yesterday, and a student brought up Lolita, and the minute she brought up Lolita, all I could think about was Lolita, and it's another book that I'm ambivalent about because I think, do I like this book or do I hate this book? But it disturbs me on so many levels, and I think Heart of Darkness does the same thing. It disturbs me, and so I can't quite say that I love it, but I can say that I think it's a
Do you know,
piece.
I'm going to confess, you know, we did...
in the spirit of literary
in the spirit
confessions,
of
that is our
confessions, I love Nabokov. I love his lectures. I love Pale Fire. You know, Pale Fire is just, I return to Pale Fire. I find it so, it's just endless in its fascination for me. I own Lolita.
Yes.
I have read the first few pages at least, probably over the last 20 years that I've owned Lolita. I've read the first few pages every couple of years, and I can't read it. I actually can't read it. I can't.
I love Lolita. So we have a full spectrum of opinions here on Lolita because I think it's one of the greatest novels ever written.
Really?
Yeah.
Can you talk, because the reason I can't read it is because my response to it is so visceral. I can't get past. I can't get past it.
Me too. I was forced to get past it because I had to do it in a master's unit. That's the only reason I read it.
I don't know.
I think, well, for me, it's, I mean, like, I completely agree that the subject matter is very upsetting and very bleak, and there's things there that I can't say I enjoyed the process of reading it in terms of, you know, it didn't make me happy to read it, but it's just so beautifully written.
It is. And
it's a real masterpiece.
That's the troubling part for me because, you know, I mean, I've only read it once, and yet that first line is still ingrained into my head. Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, Lolita.
And
even
know,
now I get
yeah,
this, shivers that run up my spine when I think
I
of it.
I think it is an interesting reading experience because it's on the one hand so objectionable in what's actually happening on a content level, but on the other hand, in terms of form and in terms of style, it's just brilliant. It's a masterpiece, and I understand people's ambivalence, and I completely understand not wanting to read it. Just for me,
I actually want to read it, but I can't because my response to it is so strong that every time I go to read it and say, Michelle, you're a 40-something-year-old woman, you can sit down and put yourself through an experience because you don't have to enjoy the things that you read. And I mean, Robinson Crusoe, case in point. I have the self-discipline.
This is going to be a Robinson Crusoe, massacre.
No, but I've had the discipline to read Robinson Crusoe from beginning to end. I didn't skip a page, which I know is in itself admirable.
You get some kind of award for that.
Absolutely.
Sure.
So but it's on a more profound level with Lolita that I can't bring myself. I can't. I mean,
Is
I guess
it because
I could.
you have little girls?
Look, I think the very first time I tried to read it was probably before I had children. Because obviously Lolita, anyone who's ever had any interest in literature knows Lolita from a very young age. And I certainly bought it intending to read it. I mean, I can even remember the second-hand bookshop in DY I bought it from.
You've had
in
long
my
history
20s.
with this.
I've had a long history, and it's not a big book.
No.
But I can't read it. I guess, I don't know if I can, but I don't think I can because I've tried so many times over so many years to do it.
It's a highly complex book in that it doesn't present a very one-sided view. The characters are so complex and so troublingly complex. I mean, even the character of Lolita herself, there are things that are said about her that I think, I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know what I want to do with that information. And there's one image in particular that I think I need to take a shower afterwards because I just went, oh God, I feel so contaminated and violated by it. But you're absolutely right. The language is so beautiful that you don't quite know what to do with this text. I mean, at least I certainly didn't know what to do with this particular text.
Look, and I actually, in some sense, I've read lots of transgressive literature, and I don't know whether it's the. I'm thinking in terms of. I actually feel that literature needs to move into zones that are difficult. So it's not even because it's definitely not on a moral point that I won't read it. It's not a moral stance. I don't believe in sort of reading about pedophilia. It's not that at all because I've read other books with lots of troubling storylines and transgressive and violent behaviour, but for whatever reason, I just, it's whether or not the little girl in me is still too strongly present that she can't work through that. Maybe it's because she's a little girl, and a lot of the transgressive literature that I've read has either been, sort of men or, I guess, sort of adult.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I've.
Well, I'm not quite sure how we got into Lolita because that wasn't actually my confessional text.
Yeah, what was your confessional text?
My confessional text is actually one that I loathe almost completely, probably maybe even more so than Robinson Crusoe. I know. And it's one that was highly recommended, and I was so looking forward to reading it. And then when I read it, I thought, and it's The Life of Pi by Jan Mattel.
I haven't read that yet, but from the movie trailers, it just looks so lame. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
No, I mean, look, it won the Man Booker Prize. It was well regarded, and I thought, oh, this must be wonderful. And I started it, and the first chapter was sort of promising, and then it ended on a challenge in a way. I mean, I'm not sure whether it intended to be a challenge, but I read it as a challenge. It ended with a particular phrase that the storyteller in the novel claims. He says, "I'm going to tell you a story that will prove the existence of God." And when someone makes such a bold claim in literature,
it's a lot to live up to, isn't it?
Yeah, I thought it went, oh, wow. I was like, I would love to see this claim, see how it works out. And then by the end of the novel, I thought it went, no, you failed. You have failed quite miserably. In fact, if you hadn't made that claim, the novel might have been actually even better without the claim, because what it shows isn't really the existence of God. I mean, I think, you know, it's quite possible that you could do it in a novel, but I'm not quite sure that this is the right setting for it. But what it does show is human resilience and the power of the imagination, which I don't quite associate with ideas of, you know, God as such. And so I thought, you know, look, it's an interesting novel in that sense, but that claim just ruined everything for me, because I'm reading through the entire novel thinking, where's God? Where's God?
Yeah.
When am I going to see
I'm
God
sure he's
now?
here.
He's
somewhere.
here somewhere. Where is he? Where is he? And then by the end I thought, okay.
Do you know, because I've read The Life of Pi, and obviously that line didn't stick for me, which retrospectively, now that I'm going back over it, I think if I'd actually sort of taken half a note or read that part and considered that as a sort of a way that shaped my reading of everything to come, because I wouldn't say that I loved it, I wouldn't say I hated it, but I think that if I'd sort of really held on to that line, I would have found it a lot more problematic, because funnily enough, I'm not really mad on allegorical stories. That in itself is a genre that it for whatever reason it doesn't naturally appeal to me.
I like allegorical story when it's sort of subtly or sort of implied allegory, whereas this one's so overtly allegorical and wants to be allegorical that I found it very almost, I hate to use the word because it's not quite a academic word to use, but lame. It's not something.
I just said it looked lame in the movie
well,
trailer.
that's true. Maybe that's why it's stuck in my head.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steph.
I think once again, because I find that images and images in writers who can produce really fierce images on the page will always probably sway me to you know, I may not love the whole endeavour of the book, but I mean, I can actually still see the island, you know, and that for me was probably and the fact that I ignored the allegory, because I know that you have to understand the allegory, but at the same time, because I don't like allegories, because unlike metaphor, where you sort of have a new meaning sort of coming into being, where something that you end up with a much more nuanced understanding of something, and understanding something in a way that hasn't been expressed before, I always find that reading one thing in terms of another is too much of a sort of a train track, and I don't like that sort of really rigid understanding or reading of things. And you see, I think if I'd rested on that line, I might have got my back up too, because I think then it becomes much more problematic in that understanding of the tiger. Yeah,
because that's the part. I mean, I watched the movie too, because my housemates are mad Ang Lee fans. We had to go see the film, and I told him, look, I have major issues with this story, and I went to the movie thinking maybe they would have picked up on this issue and removed that line too, but the line appeared again in the film. You know, it was before they told the story. The guy said, you know, I'm going to tell you a story that would prove the existence of God. I went, oh, why?
So do you think that, because I mean, to me that's a very sort of almost an anti, it's the one anti-literature thing that you can do is to sort of say that, you know, this book has a sort of a moral stance.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Book is used to, like, this story isn't a story in and of itself, it's a story to prove a point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yet it's fascinating that it won such accolades from literary readers. And I wonder if it was in that sort of, because I always find it, now I'm going to say naive, and sort of problematic to and troubling to prove a religion through a book.
Yeah.
And the only thing I'm thinking, and because I didn't read it with that in mind, is there room for, I guess, the subversion of that God?
Yeah, is he being facetious?
I mean, I did think of that.
What do you think?
But because of the way he described it, I think personally, I think the character actually believes it, which is that the troubling part. I think the character actually believes, because at the end of the story he tells what really happened, and then the allegorical or the more fantastical version, which is the version that we heard throughout the entire novel. And you're meant to favour the fantastical, magical version because the real version is just awful, and nobody really wants to read a story like that. But by the end of it, I thought it went, you know what, I mean, it wasn't effective, because I think what you've shown there is the human's ability to overcome trauma with literature, in a way, with the power of the imagination.
Which is a very secular vision.
Yeah.
It's not at all necessarily religious.
Yeah.
Except that I wonder if the God, can operate as a sort of a metaphor for transcendence, because like there is a sort of that movement in literature where how do we move beyond if everything is material and everything is explained through sort of conditions, through the psyche, through influences and forces that are ultimately measurable. So I mean, if God is like say I don't know, a monotheistic God with sort of Christian Judaism, Islam or whatever, that's one thing. But if God in this, and I mean, there's so many precedents for God not being God. God is dead. God is this. God is that. Is God in that moment a sort of a metaphor for the idea of something beyond, a transcendence, as a sort of an essential aspect of the human condition that is being, I guess, in some sense, excised through, sort of a refusal to understand anything except in terms of, sort of historical materialism.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some. Look, the novel itself, I think, if it wasn't for that one line, I wouldn't have had so much of an issue with. But it's just that one line that sort of disturbed me throughout the entire. And because I read it with that line in mind, it just it coloured the way I read the text completely. And I saw the religious allegories and I saw the religious imagery. But by the end of it, I think where it really failed me was that I actually wasn't moved by his story. I wanted to be moved by it because it seemed like such a traumatic story and such a story about human endeavours, but I just sort of went, I actually don't care that the tiger left.
Well, we've established already that Jimmy has a heart of stone.
Oh yes, that's
so
true. Heart of darkness.
Yes, you are the heart of darkness, Jimmy.
But I actually do think that is one of the effects of allegory, is that it often removes that sort of affective response. Because do you know what I mean? Like that
well,
sort
I remember
of allegory as form.
Well, even finding out as a child that the Chronicles of Narnia, or the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, was an allegory for Jesus. That distanced me from the book.
No. Yeah, fortunately I didn't find that out until somebody gave me the screw tape letters in high school, because if I'd known that any earlier, I don't know I'd have coped.
I know, I was like, I really felt for Aslan, and then all of a sudden I found out that it was something that it wasn't. And I remember reading it in a book.
It's betrayal, isn't it?
Yeah, I remember reading about that in a book, and I thought, oh God, of course it's about Jesus. But then I thought, oh, that ruins it for me. It just it takes away the emotion of that moment.
But it actually takes away the magic.
Yeah,
and the magic was the whole, sort of the central crux of that.
I think that we might too have like a resistance to being preached at. An allegory is often, not necessarily, but it often has a kind of moral didactic kind of drive to it, and I didn't want that. I don't want that. I don't want to be preached at. I don't want to have to think about these things necessarily when I'm reading. I just want to.
I want to arrive.
Yeah, I want to arrive there by myself.
Manipulation. I mean, novels are always, in some sense, it's not that we're pretending that they're neutral, because they never are. No. But there are very different ways in which to sort of arrive at, and I guess I just prefer being manipulated as opposed to, told.
That's right. Subtly manipulate me, please. Don't hit me over the head with a hammer.
Yeah, because I'm going to resist you all the way.
Yeah, that's right.
Look, I'm going to admit that, and I guess it's probably not so shocking to anyone here, but I didn't really like St. Augustine's Confessions. I don't know. Look,
St. Augustine's Confessions, that perennial favourite of everybody.
I love aspects of it. Like I loved discovering just how badly behaved students were.
Over 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, like you think we got it tough teaching in university these days? No, there is absolutely no comparison. We don't have people walking in and out, not stopping their conversations just because they happen to be in our classroom. I mean, honestly.
But he didn't have mobile phones back then.
No, that's true.
The mobile phone just doesn't compare to, sort of students actively,
not our students, but let's just say that I teach at a different institution as well. And if you have
But you don't get heckled, Jimmy. Have you ever been heckled? I've never been heckled. Not that we're wanting to be heckled, but
I've been Snapchatted
by a student.
by a student. Yeah.
Oh,
This is turning into other confessions.
I know. Tutorial confessions. Maybe that should be a different podcast.
So St. Augustine's Confessions, not the book for you?
no! Look, and the thing is that I've really diligently sort of ploughed my way through most of it. And most of it, I got to the bit about the sponge. I loved that. I thought this is a fantastic way of sort of considering. I mean, I don't think I'd ever thought of sort of God and religion, and I like discovering about the Manichaean sort of just how prevalent those Manichaeans were. I mean, they were a really sort of a dominant force, and they certainly had Augustine in their sway for some time. But I will admit that despite being very close to the end, I just never quite got there.
I didn't get there either, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was hoping somebody...
No.
And look, while we're talking about endings, I keep waiting, Jimmy, for years I've been asking you to read Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, because I hated the ending.
I haven't read it.
Look,
Here's another confession.
I got 150 pages into it, and then I got distracted by other things. But I found it so difficult to keep up with all the Russian names.
Raskolnikov!
Yeah, I got, and that's part of the problem. I couldn't pronounce the Russian name, so it made it even more. I mean, names have always been the bane of my life. I can't seem to.
Names difficult too.
Yeah, I find names very difficult to remember for whatever reason. So it's utterly humiliating in class when I always get students'
names wrong. You can remember
wrong.
lines of Shakespeare. I don't understand that. I don't understand.
But for some reason, names and numbers, maybe anything starting with N, eludes me. I just sort of. And then when you add Russian spelling to that, I thought I went, okay, now you're just playing in a completely different field here, and I have no idea what's going on. But it was so bleak, Michelle. It was just so. One bad thing after another
the ending's
happened.
Not bleak, and so you may love.
So you want more bleakness.
I needed more bleakness at that end.
It is called Crime and Punishment. That suggests a certain level of bleakness.
Yeah, but you never carried all the way through to the bitter end, and sort of the end had a sort of a redemptive, sort of salvational sort of moment. And I need somebody to talk to me about it, because I need to know whether I can sort of read into that some sort of deference to the time, or I just need somebody to, and I guess I was hoping that
that'll be me.
Well, how many years have we had? I've been waiting a long time.
It hasn't been that long. It's been about 2 years.
Oh, it's
maybe
more than that, Jimmy. It's
3. I'll give you 3 years.
Look, I think it was 4 years ago that I asked Jimmy to read Crime and Punishment for me, so we could have that conversation about the end.
I thought you were going to bring up Armadale, to be honest,
but that's a book we love.
Yeah.
Jimmy,
you two will love it, but or maybe you won't, and then.
But that's a book. Armadale by Wilkie Collins is a book that Michelle has been suggesting that we read for quite some time, and so Jimmy and I have it on our increasingly insane to be read piles, but haven't got around to it yet. But allegedly, we're going to love it.
Well, look, I mean, I've read again the first 150 pages, but 150 pages seem to be my lot in life now.
Jimmy only reads 150 pages of books and then stops.
It's true. White Teeth is another one, about 150 pages. I got into that one.
I loved White Teeth.
No, I couldn't do it.
Look, you see, I think Zadie Smith. I think her prose doesn't grab me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
She really works for me. I don't know why.
She was in your top 10.
She was in my top books of 2016.
I love what she does, but the prose, it just leaves me on the outside.
I think maybe that's the problem. I read 150 pages and I thought, I'm just not getting into this book. And it was recommended to me by a friend who is notorious for not finishing any books. She literally has
and she finished White Teeth.
And she finished White Teeth. Yeah, she had a whole bookshelf with bookmarks. She needs to buy a new bookmark every time she buys a book, because she never finishes, and the bookmark is in
So
there
it
all
was
the time.
it was a really
Yeah, it was a monumental achievement. She said,
Yeah.
"This is a book I absolutely love, and it's one of the first, or one of the few books I've actually finished." And I thought, "Oh, it must be terrific." And I got 150 pages into it and went, "Oh dear God, if this is the type of book she finishes, maybe that's why she doesn't finish all the other type of books."
I'm going to defend Zadie Smith. I think she's smart. I think she's great. I love her books. I haven't. I've had different reactions to all of them, but I've always enjoyed them. I haven't enjoyed them all to the same extent, but I really loved On Beauty, for example. Yeah, I get her.
Yeah.
Some writers just
Yeah.
click. It's a
Yeah.
clicking process.
Can
isn't
I
it?
use the remaining? We only have
Yeah.
about 5 minutes left, and I have to mention my utter hatred of Jonathan Franzen, because
Oh,
otherwise
yes.
I won't feel like I have
Confess.
Yeah,
it's really
confessed.
important to be honest, isn't it?
I really cannot stand his writing. I mean, look, I am all for reading books about, rich people with problems. I have enjoyed many books in that milieu before, and I am really into that generally. But when I read his books, I think about his characters. You don't have any problems. You're just making them up. I don't care about you. You are very privileged and whiny, and I wish you would shut up. And I actually don't think bird watching is that interesting. And there is a big strand in Freedom, which I'm not sure why I read, but I did, about bird watching, about it, how like morally superior a hobby it is. And I just find him painful. And also I really can't stand his public persona. Like, he comes out and says some horrendous things in the press. And so whenever I see him, I'm filled with this inarticulate rage. And I think, read a better book, people. Read a better book.
I'm gonna tip my hat at you right now, because I actually think that first of all, it's really difficult to find the sort of the courage to talk about sort of contemporary fiction so boldly, and I also think that it's really interesting the degree to which sort of that public persona and the writer. There is something. There is a relationship there, whether you want it or not. And I feel as though, I think I'm with you.
Yeah,
I've
it's just
only
so
ever read a few
abrasive.
pages, so I've never. Because what I tend to do is, you'll Google them to see whether you want them, and it's just been one of those books that I feel like I need to read, authors that I need to read, and so I'll get a little bit, and then I'll think, no, I actually prefer to say by Anne Carson, because I love Anne Carson, or because if I'm going to make that sort of purchase, I want to feel sort of Joy Williams, for example.
Yes, I've just been reading Joy Williams, and I've really loved her. So yes, life is too short for Jonathan Franzen. Let that be a lesson to everybody. Jimmy's suspiciously silent, so I suspect he hasn't read any Jonathan Franzen.
No, I haven't read any.
Keep that up.
No, but you did remind me of a book that I feel I do have to get off my chest, because
this is what we're here for.
I probably hate this book more than I hated Life of Pi, now that I come to think of it. And it's Lovely Bones by
that's another book that I've never read.
It was just so detestable, and for whatever reason I always seem to read these books when I'm on holiday. And I should have learned by now, I never seem to read an enjoyable book when I go on holiday, and this is one of the ones. I think I was in Alice Springs, going to see Ayers Rock, all beautiful, and then at night time I'm reading this horrific story about a child murder in a really graphic and horrible way, and how the murderer essentially gets away with it.
What bothered me about that book, though, is that it's so sentimental.
Yeah.
But not in like a way that I found organic to the situation. It's just like syrupy.
Yeah. And it was just, I think the content was so repugnant to me that by the time I finished it, I felt like I was covered in filth or something like that, and I went, I really just hate this book. And it was another really highly regarded book that was well recommended.
I have to have some books when I go away. And because I actually read Crime and Punishment last time I went to Algeria, 42-degree heat, reading Crime and Punishment, the only way to read it, I tell you, in a small room. I kid you not, if you want to have a full experience of Crime and Punishment,
I don't
lock
think I
yourself
want
in a
to have
sauna.
that full experience, to be honest.
Lock yourself in a sauna and read it there. But yeah, you have to be so careful about the books that you take away with you.
What I have a fear of is taking the wrong book on an aeroplane.
I know.
Because that's just, I mean, there's no escape. You can't get off and find something else. So my go-to aeroplane books are these crime books by Tana French, who is an Irish crime writer. And I'm really starting to panic because she's only got one book that I haven't read. And I assume I'm going to have more than one plane flight in my future. So I'm not actually sure I can do it. Like, do I just read the next book when I go on my next plane trip and then just give up on travel for the rest of my life? Like,
Well,
I really need something here.
I find Agatha Christie safe.
That's true.
If I want something quick, I mean, there's so many novels that she's written.
Yeah, that's true.
So
Maybe I should do that.
Yeah, I just grab an Agatha Christie, and one plane trip you can probably finish a novel, and it's a wonderful read.
So I just, for some reason, Tana French is my plain read, and she writes these. She's a crime writer. She writes these really kind of gripping crime novels. Some of them are a little bit far-fetched, but like not in a way that where I don't enjoy it. It's just that afterwards I think, oh God, would that actually happen? Probably not.
Well, the other one, because Michelle and I went to the Sydney Writers Festival thing, was Ian Rankin, who sounded very interesting.
I've never read any Ian Rankin.
Maybe that should be the next one to try.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I need something for my second plane trip.
Look,
some point in the future.
I think that was definitely. Well, what about Donna Leon?
Never read her either.
Oh, well, there you go. And you'd love that because they're all set in Venice.
That would be nice.
It's.
I'll add them to my list.
Yeah. Try Donna Leon.
Or Reginald Hill.
Oh, that's true. All right, that seems to be all we have time for today. That was so fun that I'm going to propose that we continue this discussion and have a second Literary Confessions talk, because I think that we really do have a lot of emotions that we need to process. Am I right?
I need to get off my chest.
Look, I didn't even begin to confess.
Oh, I know. I feel like there is
haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet.
I know.
There's still a lot of shame.
So let's rename this Literary Confessions Part 1. And we will be back for Part 2 at some unspecified point in the future. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you, Steph.
And this has been another episode of From the Lighthouse. If you could rate and review us on iTunes, that would be fantastic. Tell your friends to listen. Tell your family to listen. We would love more listeners. And please send any feedback through either through iTunes or through our website at fromthelighthouse.org. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. Bye.